I was 23 and the only daughter in a house that looked perfect from the sidewalk and felt like a locked room once the door clicked shut. Our 2-story colonial outside Boston showed off a clipped lawn and a picket fence, my father's reputation as a generous attorney, and my mother's flawless event planner smile. Inside were schedules, rules, and a silence that hummed like a live wire. I learned to read that current early, the key drop on the foyer table that told me whether to vanish the hushed calls in my father's study. That meant dinner would be a stage play, the way my mother's eyes thinned when the mascara was fresh and the wine was hidden. There were bright pinpricks, 2 small stars in a dark ceiling. On my 10th birthday, a backyard petting zoo arrived because my father had just won a case and my mother had taken her medication correctly. For an afternoon, I felt like a normal child who could be hugged without flinching. At 12 on Cape Cod, I collected shells at sunrise while my father helped me build a sandcastle that held for 2 tides. I kept a scallop shell from that week like proof that gentleness existed. School became my second oxygen supply. I kept a perfect record, not because I wanted approval, but because falling short triggered storms I could not control. Writing, though, was the secret door. In lined notebooks and school-issued journals, I wrote lives where girls stepped through thresholds and the air stayed warm on the other side. I never showed those pages at home. Dreams once named aloud in that kitchen were treated like foolishness to be put back in a drawer. Olivia Bennett noticed first, because she was kind in a way that didn't advertise itself. In 7th grade, she saw me crying in a bathroom after my father sneered that an art project was wasteful nonsense. She didn't demand details. She handed me tissues and invited me over. Her house was ordinary in a way that felt miraculous. Parents who argued softly and made up without slamming cabinets, dinners where laughter wasn't a test. In 11th grade, Miss Harrison read a thinly disguised story of mine and recognized truth pulsing under the fiction. She told me I could talk to her if I ever needed to. I wasn't ready, but the offer planted a stubborn hope. I practiced a public self that could pass inspections. I joined the right clubs, smiled at the correct volume, and left early for believable reasons. Inside, I traced a map to New York City because anonymity felt like oxygen, and New York University meant journalism and distance. I researched scholarships on school computers, printed nothing, cleared every history. Hope learned to live like a pilot light. Even when the house went cold, it kept burning. The first clean edge of the truth cut in when I was 14 and brought home all A's with 1 B+ in biology. My father's face darkened as he read, and the back of his hand arrived before any words did. My mother looked from the doorway and called it a lesson, not an injury. The point wasn't the mark on my skin, but the mark on a boundary I had not known was still movable. Control widened after that. My phone was inspected nightly. Parental controls reported every site. Curfew was fixed at 6:00 p.m. on school nights and 8:00 p.m. on weekends, with no exceptions. Friends were vetted like job applicants, and a study session at Olivia's table ended with my father at the door, tracking my location, calling collaboration a waste of time, and dragging me out in front of classmates who stared at their hands. That night, I lifted a loose floorboard and slid in a stolen notebook. I wrote what I could not say: dates, bruises hidden under sweaters in spring, the numbness of eating dinner while a storm gathered 2 chairs away. I drafted cover stories for parties I couldn't attend and learned the math of long sleeves and concealer. Some nights, I listened at my door and learned my mother's danger had its own shape. Once I heard a slap, and her crying went quiet in the way of someone who has learned to keep it there. That did not excuse what she did to me, but it explained the hollowness behind her perfect posture. I searched shelters on library computers and found a landscape of maybes and risks, most of them echoing with my father's connections, and the fear of being dragged back after failure. Survival became skill. I could tell from the weight of my father's footsteps whether to be useful or invisible. My mother's drinking deepened in cycles I could chart by the bottles I found lodged under gardening bags. When I turned 16, there was no cake, only Olivia lighting a single wick in a bathroom stall at lunch and laughing softly when we pretended that counted as a candle. I promised myself 2 more years. I would keep the grades, collect the scholarships, and walk out the door on my 18th birthday with nobody's permission. It was a foolish hope, and also the only one that fit. Junior year brought a collision between my plan and his. My father announced that I would attend Boston University or Suffolk for a pre-law track commute from home and become the story he preferred to tell at dinners. I said I wanted journalism in New York and that I could pay for most of it with scholarships I had already researched. The conversation ended hours later, near 1:00 a.m., with bruised ribs, a split lip, and the broken thing that happens when defiance meets a wall. My mother eyed me over breakfast and decided that silence cost her nothing. Mr. Davis, the guidance counselor, spotted the bruise I could not cover and offered confidentiality. Fear told me that my father's power could reach any room, so I lied about a door handle. Mr. Davis still slid brochures across his desk and mentioned Northwestern Merit Aid like a hand plastered gently over a fracture. I asked to work at the local bookstore to save money for an exit. My father told me my job was excellence and that minimum wage was a distraction from the law school story in his head. My mother's whine trickled into a stream and then into a river. Miss Ramirez in PE saw the pattern of finger marks on my back and named them as something a fall would not make. I laughed and lied and hated how smooth the lie felt in my mouth. My father began calling Olivia a bad influence, pointing at her parents' divorce as a stain, worse than anything in our house. I kept writing, kept hiding, and then opened a drawer in his study, looking for a stapler, and found a hotel receipt with 2 dinners and champagne charged 20 minutes from our house on a weekend he claimed to be in Chicago. I slid it back, exactly copied the details into my diary, and felt for the first time like I held 1 coin of currency he could not easily seize. Anger began to braid itself into the hope I carried. It didn't erase the fear, but it sharpened the edges of what I would do when I could finally move. Senior year arrived like a narrowing hallway. Applications sat scores already in deadlines that could have spelled liberation if anyone in my house believed I had a right to choose. I kept up the performance-circled dates on a hidden calendar and waited for the stage to tilt. Graduation was supposed to be the drum roll and turned out to be a tableau. I crossed the stage to polite applause. Olivia's parents waved from the seats while my own sat in the front row, like set pieces, my father checking his watch, my mother smiling with eyes that never warmed. That night, our dining room gleamed for a party assembled for appearances. My father raised a glass and announced my future in pre-law at Boston University as if I were a line item. I felt my hands shake but held my face still. By 11:00 p.m., the last guests left, and I told him I had an acceptance to New York University with partial funding, and that I was 18 and had the right to choose. He reminded me what rights looked like in our kitchen. The final blow snapped my jaw, and the mirror showed me a stranger with one eye swelling shut. My mother laughed a thin sound and called it the consequence of being useless. He told me to wash my face and be ready to enroll in the morning. On the floor of the bathroom, I learned that clarity can arrive inside a cliff of pain. I did not cry because crying hurt. I formed a plan because thinking did not. For 2 weeks, I lived on liquids through a straw and pretended to recover from what he told neighbors was a fall downstairs. I asked to go to the public library for summer reading and used the computers to create a new email. Olivia answered within hours with only support and no questions. I found our old digital camera and documented each day's healing so that a timeline would exist. I bought a small recorder with cash. Olivia slipped into my palm and captured the threats not because I wanted to hear them again, but because other people would need to. When I could speak, I waited until Miss Harrison finished a community workshop and told her the entire story from the first bruise I can remember to the last one I could not hide. She did not interrupt. She connected me to Sarah Jenkins, an attorney who specialized in domestic violence and who knew the geometry of danger and the patience of safety plans. Sarah said my documentation was strong and reminded me that being 18 widened my choices. I asked for time to ready every piece. She also discovered through quiet calls that the Bar Association was already circling my father for ethics violations and funds gone missing. It explained the tremor I had seen under his control, and it warned us that cornered men lash out. Through Miss Harrison's network, New York University agreed to consider an emergency application for the journalism program with special circumstances aid, and I wrote a personal statement that felt like removing a splinter the length of my life. Olivia's family offered their guest room as a staging ground, so we moved my most irreplaceable things in small bags passed at the library, including the Cape Cod shell wrapped in a scarf. The date set itself when I overheard plans for my father's birthday dinner in mid-July. Guests would make the house a stage set again, and witnesses would alter the math of risk. On the morning of the party, I watched the sun slip down the street and felt a stillness I had not known before. I didn't feel brave. I felt ready. That evening, the house filled with colleagues in polished shoes, neighbors bearing bottles of wine, and relatives who praised my father for his commitment to justice and to his community. I wore a blue dress my mother chose and arranged my hair to shadow the last yellowing of my jaw. Dinner unfolded in courses while my father performed the role he loved best, and my mother watched the room like a director cueing every line. When the gifts began, I brought a small box to him and said it held memories he might wish to see. The flash drive slid into the media computer, and the screen filled with my face the night after graduation, the crooked jaw and dried blood, the timestamp verifying what anyone with eyes could already understand. Gasps scattered through the room. My father moved to block the screen, and a recording of his voice unfurled threats dropping like stones into a well. He called it manipulation. He said any teenager could fake photos and edit audio. He said I was imaginative. The doorbell rang, and Officers Ryan and Torres stepped into the foyer I had polished that morning. I had called before the party and asked them to arrive after dessert. They separated us into rooms, took statements, and listened to my mother unravel when presented with evidence and the pressure of a uniformed stranger's calm questions. My father tried to leverage old connections over the phone and found that the lines he used to tug did not pull the room the way they once had. They cuffed him in front of his partners and neighbors and read him his rights while he promised that I would regret this, that I was nothing without the family machine he had built. I answered steady for once that a facade can be powerful until it cracks, and then it becomes a mirror nobody wants to look in. Guests drifted out with their heads down, stepping around ribbon and plates, like they were walking through the ruins of a set. My mother locked herself in her room and glass shattered where she kept the bottles she thought I didn't know about. Olivia's car waited at the curb, headlights off. I walked through the house one last time and took only what could not be replaced: the legal packet Sarah had prepared, the camera, the recorder, and the shell from that week when we pretended to be a family. At the front door, I paused not to say goodbye to walls, but to the girl who had learned to sit quiet and calculating under them. I closed the door and climbed into Olivia's passenger seat. We drove without speaking, and I slept deeply for the first time in years. In the morning, after a safe breakfast at her kitchen table, Miss Harrison's friend drove me south toward a city I had drawn in my mind so many nights that it already felt mapped under my feet. 1 year later, rain stitched the window of a tiny Brooklyn studio, and I finished an article for the university paper about recognizing warning signs in teenage relationships. The room was mine in the way that Matter's chipped mug on the sill, books stacked in columns that leaned like tired buildings, the scent of rain and street food, and bus brakes drifting up when I opened the window. Healing did not arrive as a clean slate. It came like weather changing without permission. Some nights I woke with my heart galloping and the feeling of hands at my throat. On sidewalks, a sudden shout could widen the world too fast, and I would need to sit and breathe until color returned to the edges of things. Dr. Patel, the trauma therapist at the counseling center, helped me understand that the brain can be injured and also repaired, that each act of choosing for myself laid down a new path in the forest of my mind. A support group became a second kind of classroom. We sat in a circle, traded strategies for flashbacks, and celebrated milestones that would sound small to outsiders and felt like mountains to us. News of my father reached me in careful, measured updates from Sarah. Once the first story cracked, others followed. Former clients told auditors about missing money. A legal secretary described a pattern of harassment that supervisors had been too timid to stop. My medical records obtained after proper treatment for my jaw answered questions with the cool authority of X-rays. In the end, a judge sentenced Frank Thompson to 8 years in prison for domestic assault, financial crimes, and witness intimidation. His law license was revoked permanently, and the Bar Association returned his framed certificate in a plain envelope. My mother checked herself into a 90-day rehabilitation program and wrote me a letter I read more than once. She accepted responsibility without excuses and asked for nothing. Dr. Patel said I could answer or not, that forgiveness is not an obligation, and timing is part of the wound's geometry. Mr. Davis emailed to say my case had changed, how he approached students who might be in danger, and Miss Harrison visited during spring break and told me that strength sometimes looks like doing the next necessary thing. I believed her finally because my own life had become a list of small, necessary things that added together looked like a person rebuilding. The circle of my days widened. Zoe, my roommate, understood when I needed quiet, and when quiet turned into isolation and coaxed me out for late-night dumplings after study sessions. In a creative writing elective, I met Ethan, a photography student who moved slowly in the best sense of the word. We became friends for 6 months before we tried dating, and when I told him everything 2 weeks in, he took my hand like it was a precious object and simply thanked me for trusting him. The civil suit settlement against my father, combined with scholarships, steadied my finances enough that I could focus on classes and work a campus job I actually liked. I started a tiny foundation with a simple name, Next Chapter, to provide emergency funds for young adults escaping abusive homes, because the gap between deciding to leave and being able to leave is where danger often swells. The university paper asked me to make my first article a recurring column, so I wrote about boundaries, gaslighting, safe exits, and how to help a friend without making decisions for them. A guidance counselor in Queens invited me to speak at a high school, then another school asked, and soon I stood in classrooms and auditoriums telling teenagers what I wish someone had told me, in terms simple enough to keep specific enough to use. I did not list my own details. I told them how to recognize a locked room when the door looks decorative, and how to find the hinges. I kept the shell on my desk, and sometimes held it when the city felt too loud, a reminder that even fragile things can survive the pound of waves if the timing is right. When a panic spike arrived on the subway, I practiced the breathing techniques Dr. Patel had taught me and wrote sentences in my head until the train doors opened. When I thought about my mother, I pictured the letter in my drawer and understood that even if we speak someday, it will be on ground I choose. When I thought about my father, I still felt the old fear, but it no longer ran the lights in my mind. Writing had been the secret door. It became the way I laid planks over broken places so others wouldn't fall through. The lesson that settled into my bones was not about vengeance or headlines, but about ownership. Control, as he practiced it, was a counterfeit currency that buys nothing lasting. The real thing is the ordinary miracle of making choices in your own name. If you are holding a small pilot light of hope right now, protect it. Feed it. Build around it until you can carry it into daylight. If this story found you in a difficult place, I hope it offers not just recognition, but a direction. If it found you safe, I hope it sharpens your attention for someone who is not. Thank you for listening, and thank you for believing that stories like mine can become starting points rather than endpoints. If this resonated, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, subscribe for more stories that heal and empower, and tell me in the comments where you found your strength or where you hope to.